Hey guys, Montel, and welcome to this edition of Let's Be Blunt with Montel. My guest today is an Indian American attorney and longtime drug policy activist who's been writing, passing, and implementing equitable cannabis laws for over 20 years. She served as the commissioner of the MA Cannabis Control Commission from 2017 to 2020. She left to focus on running the Parabola Center, a nonprofit think tank that pushes for equity in cannabis policymaking. She's been described as the people's weed watchdog. Shaleeen Title, thank you so much for being honest with us today on Let's Be Blunt with Montel.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. Why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, where you went to college?
Sure. I grew up in the Chicago area, child of immigrants, and I went to college at University of Illinois. I got involved in drug policy around that time in college. As a student, you could be involved in changing marijuana laws. So that's how I got started.
And, you know, there are not a lot of you out there. This is back in 2020 when you got involved?
2002 when I got involved.
2002. Well, that's about the same time that I got involved in cannabis. And there's not a lot of people back there who are really literally sticking their necks out at a time when it would look like this may not have moved forward. So thank you so much for all the advocacy.
Same to you.
Absolutely. Now, when did you know you wanted to dedicate your professional career to cannabis policy?
There was one point. So I grew up in a traditional Hindu household, and our general philosophy is do your duty, do your karmic duty, and see where fate takes you. And for me, it has taken me to cannabis policy. But there was one point after I graduated law school in 2008, I had decided to do tax law. And my first day, September 15, 2008, was the biggest crash, I think, of all time at that point, the biggest stock market crash. And I just felt in the following days that I could not be working to make rich people richer. And I wanted to do cannabis advocacy full time. So I quit that job. I took a more than 50% pay cut. And like you said, this was a time when we didn't even know if legalization was going to happen. But I felt like that was important.
There were some states back then that were passing cannabis, medical cannabis laws.
Right.
Let's go back for a second. Were you a recreational cannabis user? Had you dabbled in cannabis? Had you known about it back when you first started advocating?
Yeah, I was a casual cannabis consumer for sure. Still am. But I think that what was really attractive to me was the fact that we had regular people, you know, like you said, pioneers, patients, people who were directly affected that were passing these laws. And to me, that was very different from the way that other laws were being passed.
And growing up being an immigrant, your family's originally from India, right?
Yes.
Do me a little favor. Explain to me, because I've had multiple people try to explain this. Cannabis is not illegal. Well, it is illegal in India if you try to sell it, right? But it grows openly in India. I was in Mumbai, and I also was in a couple of different places in India, and remember somebody saying, well, you know, this bang has been here for a long time. So, I mean, what was the attitude about cannabis in India?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I'm not an expert on the legal status there, but yes, it's been used for thousands of years in India. There's a festival that just passed called Mahashivratri, and bhang is the typical product that is consumed at that time. So it's used all over India.
That's cannabis infused in milk, right?
That's cannabis infused in milk, right, with almonds and spices. And it's used all the time at festivals. It's used casually. It's grown all over the place. I would say it's generally similar to what you might think of as decriminalized here or maybe in the Netherlands. But on paper, it is certainly illegal.
So you wouldn't get arrested for having consumed it. You get arrested if you try to sell it, right?
I think that's right. I think it would depend on what state you're in, but I think that's generally right.
Gotcha. Okay. Now, when you were you were the Mass Cannabis Commissioner for 3 years, can you tell me a little bit about, you know, mass regulations and how they differ from other states?
Yeah, so we were the first state to pass what's commonly known as social equity. So making sure that people who have been harmed the most by cannabis prohibition are benefited in some way. And because we were the first, I would say we did not get it completely right, but we learned a
Nor
lot
has
of lessons,
anybody.
and nor does anybody, certainly. But one thing I think we did really well was anti-monopoly protections. So in Massachusetts, you can't have more than 3 of any type of cannabis license. So that kept a company from dominating the market right away. And then we also have a lot of policies that help encourage small businesses. One of them, for example, is called Freshly Baked. I know you're connected with them as well.
I'm connected with Freshly Baked without a doubt. They are my contract manufacturers in the state. Yes.
Yes. So I was very lucky. I got to receive the first adult use delivery on the East Coast back in the summer of 2021. And the way that we had set up that transaction, or that market policy, was that only companies like Freshly Baked, that are social equity micro businesses, are able to create their products and then deliver it straight to the consumer and skip retail altogether. So I think that's an example of the type of innovation that helps to encourage those businesses, while also keeping other businesses from getting so big that they dominate.
And that's one of your bigger fears, is the fact that well, look what's going on right now. I mean, we have these multi-state operators who are literally right now coming in and trying to take over the entire marketplace, right?
That's my biggest fear, yes. And I'd say that's what I spend the majority of my time working on currently, is trying to keep that from happening.
Okay. And do you work just in Mass? Or are you working nationally? What are you doing?
Nationally, yeah. So after my term as commissioner ended, I started a nonprofit think tank, Parabola Center, and it's a charity. I run it as a volunteer, and it's really my way of giving back, because I want everyone to have the education and the expertise to be able to advocate for what they want to see in terms of the cannabis industry. So everybody has power. Even if you're a consumer alone, you have buying power. If you're in the industry, you choose what other companies you decide to work with. And so it's about being educated and using the power that you have to support people and small businesses, not those large companies that want monopolies.
Now, we talk a lot about social equity in the cannabis industry, but there is much, much, much more work that needs to be done. What are some of the most important aspects that support successful social equity programs?
Well, I've actually stopped using the term social equity
Yeah.
because it's become so vague to be meaningless. But I think the most important aspects are identifying the population that you're seeking to support, and doing that in a constitutional way. So our policies in Massachusetts have been challenged, but never successfully. They have held up the whole time. And it's because we've been really careful to make sure that any groups that are getting special benefits are um, documented by evidence that they have been harmed by the drug war. So that's the first aspect. And then the second aspect is deciding by listening what benefits they'll have. So something like the direct to consumer model I just described for Freshly Baked, lending, real estate, technical assistance, all of these different benefits that the groups ask for. Those are the 2 most important aspects for a successful social equity program. And of course, that continues to be something that we're working on. The one other thing I'll mention, though, about social equity is, once you describe it to people, surveys show that this is actually something that everyone supports, Democrats and Republicans too. It's actually not controversial at all that we should be using cannabis laws to give back to the communities that have been the most harmed.
I'm surprised that you say it's something that is recognized from both sides of the fence, because I've been in some places where, though, it just seems like that's recognized that yes, we should, but a lot of lip service and not a lot done.
That's right. That's right. I think it's 2 things. One is that it's just hard to get it done. And then the other thing is, it interferes with some people's profit models. So they're not going to support it. But when you survey citizens, they absolutely support this idea of social equity.
Gotcha. And which states do you think have put together the best cannabis regulations, and why?
Right now, I would say New York, because I think New York has done an excellent job of seeing what happened in other states and actively trying to learn the lessons. So I know, for example, with their social equity applicants, they are getting to go first. They are getting real estate. They are getting funding. It takes a long time to set these structures up so that they work. But that's what New York is committed to.
Well, you know, and when New York comes on and New Jersey comes on in full blow, I mean, we just witnessed that 2021, $25 billion worth of legal cannabis was sold here in the United States. And that's not even taking into account the gray and black markets, which we probably were about 50 billion. So making cannabis about a $75 billion a year industry, which would put it up in the top of some of the best performing industries in the entire country if you put it all together. Um, when do you see the Fed moving in any direction that seems to be more realistic than what we're doing today? I mean, what's so crazy, I can't understand how we can sit back and beg, not beg, but take as much as we can from a tax standpoint and regulate from putting unnecessary fees on top of things, how long this can exist and have a robust legal market. The fact that, the black and gray market seems to outperform the legal market 2-1. It's only, to me, seemingly getting worse. What do you think, if you put your crystal ball on as much as you've been working on legislation in this area? I mean, when do you think the Fed's going to make a move to say, yeah, we're doing something a little stupid here?
I think it's going to be many years, maybe 10 years, but I actually think that's a good thing. And I know that surprises people, coming from someone working on legalization for the past 20 years. But I think it's a good thing because we really need that time, because federal legalization is actually going to cause a lot of problems that we can't see right now because they're not happening yet.
Why don't you explain that to some people? So explain it to my listeners.
So first you have to understand that there are urgent things and there are non-urgent things, and we can separate them. So I would consider urgent things being making sure that medical patients have access, that they can grow at home, that they can have caregivers to grow for them, expunging people's records, freeing people who are incarcerated for cannabis. These are urgent. What
Also,
takes a lot?
getting rid of some of the old draconian laws, like the packaging laws, which are just absolutely as antiquated as they can be. Some of the taxation, which is absolutely ridiculous, especially in Mass and other places. I mean, the taxes are so high that it forces people to go back on the ground.
Absolutely. Right. We have like a 20% effective tax rate in Massachusetts. We have labeling that I don't think complies with public health
And especially the fact
standards. It goes overboard. Yeah.
it's so overboard in the packaging. I mean, come on now. I can buy, deadlier products in the drugstore or, at CVS's or at Walgreens than I can getting them out of some dispensaries. Come on. I go into Walgreens, I can buy a bottle of aspirin. It just has like just a little single screw cap that, is considered a childproof cap. And if a child buys that, takes it home, they open it, hey, you have that bottle, they're dead on the kitchen floor before they come home. Where we have some packaging requirements for cannabis products that are just ridiculous.
They are ridiculous. They're absolutely ridiculous. And to your point, overhauling them is a relatively straightforward process because we have so many other models in place, like aspirin. But I would still put that in the non-urgent category in the sense of it's not, life or death. And so I think that being able to separate those two things is really important because it is going to take time to develop a market structure, labeling, testing, all of that at the federal level. And we should be starting that process now. So once we separate those two things, urgent and non-urgent, then we need to look around and see what actually will happen after federal legalization that hasn't happened yet. So it's three things. The first thing is that we have not seen giant companies like Amazon or Big Tobacco enter the market yet because they're not taking the risk of entering the market for a federally illegal product. So that is going to change. The second thing that's going to change is we now have dozens of individual state markets But once we have federal legalization, they'll be able to have commerce in between states. They'll be able to operate in multiple states.
That's if the states go for it. I'm just starting to figure out. I mean, places like Georgia just passed a law that's going to make it almost impossible for any other state who's producing a cannabis product right now to be able to provide their products in their state because their law requires that the products don't have more than 5% THC in them. So they're writing regulations that really are counter to almost every other state that's passed a law to date. They don't allow for edibles. They don't allow for any. They don't even allow for any
Right.
online marketing. Come on.
So you may not be able to keep policies like that after legalization. They might violate the Dormant Commerce Clause. So I suggest people who are interested keep following Parabola Center because these are the types of issues that we put out education about. And I think that you're right. We want to make sure that we don't have states that have regulations that are so strict that they're going to, not really even allow anybody to operate. So the third thing is that so far it's been activists up until the past few years. It's been largely patients who are impacted and people who are impacted that have been passing these laws. And when, we've seen challenges in the past few years, like trying to stop people from being able to grow at home, they mostly haven't been successful. But once we have federal legalization and there is real lobbying money that we haven't seen before, those struggles to pass policies are going to be very different from what we've seen the past 20 years. And so when you put those three things together, I think it becomes very clear, especially to people like us that have been doing this for the past decades, that we want to be very intentional about how it looks. And we want to make sure that people who will be impacted understand these issues and that they're advocating for the vision of legalization that they want and not just leaving it up to chance.
Gotcha. And again, you think it'll be 10 years out, but I mean, I think we're going to have to clean out the Senate and the House with some of these ancient politicians before we actually move this ball forward. I think we've got too many diehards who have been around for too long, who've been discussing this for 20 years and given the right to make decisions that got to get out, right?
I think they've got to get out. Yeah. And whoever replaces them is going to have a much more current view, I hope.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, what do you think are some of the most important, other than the ones that you just addressed, other important issues when it comes to, I mean, just recently, last week, the DEA just issued a memo about, THC8, some of the other derivatives, and synthetic or not synthetic, but manipulated versions of cannabinoids. And I've been saying this for years now. I've been against THC8 and THCO and all the things that we are creating that may not necessarily even actually be agonists for our endocannabinoid system. I mean, we don't even know. I mean, the summer science has not really followed or kept up to figure out whether or not even THCA can even be absorbed and which one of our receptors actually picks that up. So, that's the reason why I think there's so many people having such a hard time with it, that are using like THC8 and having all these very different outcomes. But that's a problem with our industry. This is an industry that literally just basically, on itself.
I don't know if I have anything to add to that. I think you're completely right. And I think that our regulations are moving much faster than the science. And yeah, we're not talking about the bong that's being used in India, for thousands of years. We're talking about chemicals that have been changed, just now that haven't been tested, that we should not be letting people, essentially experiment with.
And selling them in 7-Elevens and
selling them.
gas stations. Come on now.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's really bad. That's when I've been really just speaking as loudly as I could for years now about the fact that the industry needs to do a better job at policing itself. I mean, that's part of the other problem that we have, I think, is that we're in an industry now that everybody is really after their own. I mean, nobody's really, I can remember back in 2004, 5, 6, 7, when I was traveling around the country speaking for a lot of different legislators, it seemed to be there were at least 3 or 4 different groups that, though they may have had different agendas, they all seemed to work together. Now it's so disjointed, everybody's trying to scratch out their own little piece of pie that they don't work to work together anymore.
That's why I had to start a new organization, because I couldn't find one. And I think that what has changed is there's a profit incentive now that we didn't have then. And I think when you have a profit incentive, that's very different from working for public health and public safety.
Right, right, right. So now, I mean, again, you think New York is going to try to get this relatively right?
So far, I think that they've really been committed to the principles that are on paper, but you really never know until it rolls out on the ground, right?
Right, right, right. I'm looking at Mass now. Mass has just now started issuing public consumption licenses, right? Or
They haven't started issuing them, but the regulations are in place.
regulations are in place, so they're going to start doing that pretty soon. And what do you think? How do you think that's going to affect the overall trajectory of, let's say, legalization nationwide? Because you're going to have. Well, we already know that when talking to some of the leaders in tourism around the world, there's indications that anywhere from 45 to 50% of people who are now calling any travel agency in the country and the world have questions about cannabis. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that, to me, I think is going to help push this forward a little bit more, because as states start battling for those tourist dollars,
Yes.
we're going to start recognizing that more and more states are going to start begging that some of the walls come down that block people from coming to their state, right?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. Let me start with the short term kind of pessimistic thing, which is that unfortunately the mass regulations, which I led on, are terrible. So, what we had to get in order to get the votes for it to pass is this system where you can't even smoke or vape indoors. Edibles have to be prepackaged. You can't have infused meals. They are not workable as they are. They have to be changed. But the long view is I completely agree that it's people that are changing this. We have, I think, 1 out of 5 adults in Massachusetts at least are consumers now. And they are going to affect so many different forms of the economy. But for sure, tourism is a huge one. Just like craft wine, craft beer, craft food are all important tourism sub industries, I guess. And like you just said, that's something that can't be taken away. Like you can't take that away from, say, Massachusetts or New York, and grow it somewhere else and import it, because it's a tourism experience. So I think that's going to be huge moving forward once we get these regulations right.
Sure. And then, now you also have, in recent years, we've been seeing a lot of these MSOs, these multi-state operators, pop up, and they figured out how to get around the laws by just using their dollars to go from state to state to state to state to state to build out products. And then, I'm not trying to, in a way, it's kind of what I'm doing, is that I literally have a brand that's in Mass. I have a Massachusetts manufacturer. I'm going to go to Georgia. I'll have a Georgia manufacturer. I might go into, North Carolina if it passes, or Illinois, and do the same thing. I've already got a CBD line out it hits marketplace in about another 2 weeks. That's national. So I'm in essence almost like an MSO myself, which is really what I poo poo. But at the same time, I think I have a quality product that is and does good for consumers. I mean, do you think that that's really how to do it? I'm an individual and have a very small company. However, we're going to blink an eye, and all of the former tobacco manufacturers, some of the drug manufacturers are going to start stepping in. We just saw, a week ago, that was it Pfizer just spent $6.7 billion to purchase another pharmaceutical company that was working on a specific type of cannabinoid. When you get the Pfizer's, I can't compete against Pfizer, and I don't think anybody else at my level could compete against a Pfizer. What do you think about this whole big MSO thing that's happening, is taking over the country right now?
I think there's nothing inherently wrong with being a multi state organization. I think there's a lot of small businesses that I frequent that I hope will be able to grow to other states. I think where we start to see problems is when companies get so big that they are trying to reduce competition and they're trying to impact regulations so that they're not being regulated for the point of public health and public safety anymore. And I think most important, and this is primarily what I work on because it is so largely invisible, is the threat of big tobacco, big alcohol, and big pharma.
We know
And
there are, yeah. Right.
they are absolutely working to take over at the federal level to write the legalization bills. But what's really interesting is that they are not so powerful that, for example, they can get a federal legalization bill passed. Many of them were working on the Safe Banking Act, which didn't pass. And they've started front groups to try and look like activists, right? So if activists weren't powerful, why would you be pretending to be an activist? So I think we have plenty of time, if we start now and we are very careful about it, to make sure that we don't have another big tobacco or big alcohol, big pharma.
And we do know, you just said activists. We know activists are powerful because that's the only reason why I think that we've reached the level that we've reached today.
Yes.
But unfortunately, and just let me hear your views about this. I mean, I know you are, but you were, an N of one, in a sense that, I find it just crazy that I go to, a lot of different conventions, and I've spoken at a lot of different ones around the world, and you walk in the door and everybody's, yeah, we gotta come together. And then as soon as the speech is over and you go out in the hallway and it's like, nah, you gotta pull teeth to get a card. You gotta, nobody seems to want to work with each other because everybody's so afraid of their own little fiefdom. I mean, don't you think that this has got to stop at the grassroots level? I mean, it's got to start and stop there. We got to stop this idea that, a rising tide doesn't lift all boats, and go back to the idea that we work together. I mean, this is an industry that I think by now, come on, 20 years in, we should be at a point where, we are the biggest lobbyists down in Washington, D.C., but instead it's pharma, not us. And as long as pharma gets to say, don't let them in, we won't get in.
You know what I think we could unite on, though, is keeping out big tobacco and big pharma. I think no matter whether you're like a tiny entrepreneur or an MSO, anybody in the industry right now should be afraid of that, unless they're trying to get acquired by them. But one way we can do it is, have you heard of mandatory disqualifications? So in most states, you can't enter the industry if you have a certain criminal background. Sometimes it's cannabis convictions, which is, of course, ridiculous. In other places, it's like fraud, other types of business-related convictions. What we should have is, if you, like the big tobacco industry, have been found to be guilty of lying to the public for profit, manipulating your product to be more addictive, knowing that it kills people and not telling anybody, all of these things that big tobacco has done, that should be a mandatory disqualification for getting into the cannabis industry. I think that's something we could unite on.
Well, we could unite on it, but big money that goes along with those big companies, may be what shuts us down in trying to block them. I mean, again, I say big money. Come on, $25 billion in the legal marketplace. And all I keep hearing from people in the industry is that, well, but Montel, that's really not $25 billion because, we had to spend 20% of that in taxes. Okay, so let's say 20% of it, take it off the top. That's $20 billion that we could still come together on and utilize in an effort to lobby Congress the same way as big pharma does. And I think we make big differences. But again, everybody in this industry is too busy trying to get themselves their own yacht or their Mercedes Benz or their Rolls Royce, rather than try to come together to move the industry forward so that 10 years from now, there could be other people buying Mercedes Benz. You know what I mean?
Yes. And it's not just about money, though, right? Like, people were telling us, right, in 2005, big pharma is never going to let legalization pass, right? But look what happened. And it wasn't because of money. It's because people like you and Sanjay Gupta and people who had the trust of the public talked about why we should change the laws. And eventually that's why it changed. It didn't change because of big money.
Right. You are right, but I've been jaded in the fact that I just don't see. I mean, there was a time when you had DPA, MPP, all these different organizations that, though again, each one of them were trying to eke out their own little footprint, they were at least working together. I got involved in Pennsylvania like 8 years ago, and literally one of the only events that I went to that both MPP and DPA were together with us, all with the same front. And now, a lot of these organizations, though their leaders have passed, um, uh, don't seem to want to work together anymore. And I'm just sorry, have you run across that too?
Yeah, and I get jaded too, and I take a break and I come back because that's all you can do.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, you talk a lot about what we learned from history and alcohol regulations. A lot of people don't even understand is that the biggest proponent of prohibition, Anslinger, when he lost his job because they passed rules and lifted prohibition, that's who was the jerk who started pushing forward for cannabis prohibition and was successful at it because he had the backing of the William Randolph Hearst of the world and the Charles DuPonts of the world who funded that. Um, we're at a time right now where if we were to look at, I mean, you talk a lot about, the difference in going back in history and taking a look at alcohol regulation and, how we should apply some of those things to cannabis, right? What do you think?
Yeah, and it's never going to be a waste of time to do that because things that were put in place after prohibition was lifted are still in place now. And when you ask why, I used to ask why in government, they don't know the answer. They said somebody put this in place 100 years ago and it's still there. So that's the kind of decisions that all of us are going to be in charge of, and it's going to have a really lasting impact. I think two things that I highlight about alcohol regulation is one, that they deliberately did not allow vertical integration. So that means that one company can't own the entire supply chain, from manufacturing to retail. And that's not something that's being discussed similarly in cannabis. So it's something to be aware of.
Yeah,
The
and
second,
lots of states do issue these completely vertical licenses
right.
to just one company, or like right now we're dealing in Georgia, and Georgia's got going to end up with 5 licenses that are all completely vertical. But
That's so bad.
yeah, and they only have 2 of them out there right now.
So if people are interested in this, I have a paper called Preventing Cannabis Monopolies, published by the Ohio State University Drug Enforcement and Policy Center. And I talked to anti-monopoly experts, and the first thing they all said was prevent vertical integration, because when you allow it, you're going to have situations just like that in Georgia. So that's the one thing. The other thing is craft beer and wine, because of a lot of struggle, they've had good policies that are put in place, and we can start that now. So one is the direct to consumer model that I mentioned. Other is tourism, but there's so many different ways that small businesses can get together and fight for legalization policies that protect them. And from what I see, that's not happening yet, and it's really ripe for it right now.
Well, and you also say that federal legalization will also threaten small business companies and their ability to compete, will it not?
Yes, it absolutely will. And I think that if people were more aware of what interstate commerce would look like by default, the size of the companies that are going to enter by default, and then the fact that this won't be, small activists talking to their city councilor or their state legislator right now, saying, I have a condition or I want to start a business. That is how the laws have passed up until now. When it changes and it's big tobacco and it's Pfizer, it's going to look very different. And the reason I keep emphasizing that is because the intuition is to look around and say, hey, the cannabis industry is not so bad. Let's pass legalization. Let's deal with research and taxes and labeling. But you should be a little bit scared of it. You should be, because if it doesn't turn out well, we're not going to be able to reverse it.
Right. Right. And I mean, so would the best idea be to start activism on your state level for those who are tuned in, and then try to shift to the federal level? Let's clean up the act of your background, your backyard first, right?
I think that's absolutely right. And once we have good policies at the state level and we can point to them, it's going to be a lot easier at the federal level to protect it or to replicate it.
Gotcha. Now, again, let's talk a little bit more about. You just said in Massachusetts, though the regulation has passed, they have not issued any licenses yet for public consumption.
Yeah. For social consumption. Yeah.
So how do you think? And a lot of states are right now looking at social consumption um, initiatives all the way across the board. A lot of them that already passed, especially adult use laws, are starting to look at rewriting laws now for social consumption. But how do you think that's going to impact the idea of more and more people understanding the need for medical? You know what I'm saying? I
Mhm.
literally walked out of I was at a convention this weekend in California, the World Brain Mapping Society's annual convention. Some of the top neurologists in the world walked out of, probably one of the nicest hotels in all of downtown Los Angeles, and I was walking down the street with a couple of the people who were attendees of the conference. One or two were neurologists, and one of the first things that one of the doctors said when we walked out, stepped in the street, goes, "I smell marijuana." I was like, "Yeah, you do. You don't smell it
I
everywhere.
do.
Wait till you go to New York, because you're going to smell it in the street anywhere you go." Because they have now, as long as you don't do it in front of a school, anywhere you can smoke a cigarette, you can smoke
Yeah,
cannabis.
so good.
It is good, but at the same time, it also raises the ire of that generation that's still, "I can't stand cannabis." Do you think that when we start having restaurants or social lounges open and then wafting into the air out in the street, is it going to just piss more people off? Excuse my mouth, or is it going to become something that people recognize as, "That's okay, because I can't be affected by it unless I stand here and sniff it up as much as I can"?
I think it's a solvable problem. We have had so many decades to work on this with tobacco, and we found, lounges that are closed or outdoor areas or designated, places where you can stand. I think we can use all of that to make sensible social consumption laws. But what I worry about is the emergency room visits for children, because data shows that more children are getting into edibles, and it's causing them harm. They have to go to the ER. I think
And,
it's
and
a
expensive,
reasonable
but,
thing.
but, but some of that's expensive because of this Delta 8 that's on sale in,
Yes.
7-Elevens and gas stations. Some of those children would not have access to that if they shut that crap down. Excuse my mouth.
I think that's right. And I also think some of it is people who would have not gone to the hospital before during Prohibition because they would have been scared, or they wouldn't have admitted that that's what they were using. So, yeah, a lot of that can explain it. But nonetheless, I think the data is still showing that the visits are increasing. And I think people are right to be concerned about it. So I'm more worried about that than tobacco smoke. But either way, the point is we have public health standards in place that we've learned that we can apply to cannabis. And sometimes the profit incentive and the public health incentive are going to contradict each other. And I think a lot of us have to stand for the public health incentive in that case, because if you have, with something like tobacco or, vaping, you have a big public health crisis, then our policymakers are just going to ban everything and roll it back, right? Like we've seen how they have knee-jerk reactions, and we don't want that to happen.
And but now, do you not think that? And I'll just throw this out. I mean, I think one of the things that this industry has done that's been pretty good in the last few years is that we do a lot of B2B. There are a lot of conferences all over America, B2B conferences every other week. There's another one. But what we do is a really piss poor job, excuse my mouth again, of doing B2C, the
Mm,
business responsibility of educating the consumer.
mm.
We don't. And if we took the time to really truly educate the consumer, we could let the consumer know that, if you overeat some, infused cannabis edible product, you ain't dying. I mean, no one in the history of cannabis has died from, consuming too much. You might go to sleep for a little while. It's going to maybe the next morning give you a little headache, maybe, depending on your own, endocannabinoid system. But at the same time, if we spent more time educating the masses and saying that if you did overindulge, just sit down, relax, you're not dying. You don't have to go to the emergency room. But we don't even spend a lot of time doing that.
Or
Um,
educating them just to say, lock this up, keep it away from your
from your
kids,
kids,
keep it from your
sure,
dogs. Like all of that education is very important.
right. And but don't you think that that's the responsibility of us, the cannabis providers? I mean, I'm appalled by the fact that there aren't. And again, some states the way they legislated the programs is what stops us from educating.
It stopped. Oh, because it stops companies from making claims, you mean?
Well, not just for making claims, but you can't even promote your product. You can't say, well, if you come
Mhm.
in, you do this, and we can tell you that if you happen, make sure. I mean, at the end of every single one of those commercials could be a really unbelievable public service announcement. Make sure that you lock this product up when you go home. Don't have it anywhere near your children. But we don't even get to say that.
Yeah. I think that's a great question. I think that in general, the answer is for me is no, I don't think that businesses in general should be responsible for this because you mentioned earlier, like an industry policing itself. I don't think we have a lot of examples that industries that successfully police themselves.
Oh, I'll give you one right
But,
now. I'll
but,
give
but,
you,
but wait, let me finish the
okay.
point though. But
Mhm.
the problem there is the biggest companies, right, that are trying to change regulations or outsmart them. I think there are a lot of smaller businesses that would, in fact, do a good job of educating. And you make that distinction of scale. And then you bring in people who are trusted members of their local communities to be part of the education.
Well, I mean, if we go back 30, 40, 50 years, probably 40 years ago, they legalized oxygen as a medical treatment. Remember when they started allowing hyperbaric chambers to be used not only for diving, but for the masses? The hyperbaric industry was kind of, in a way, similar to the cannabis industry. It was an industry that was just kind of loosely regulated. There were no national organizations that brought them together. But then they started realizing that oxygen, could air be dangerous? Yes, air can be dangerous if you implement a hyperbaric chamber, you put people in it the wrong way, and you overpressurize them. It could be dangerous. So that industry had to step out and say to themselves, okay, we got to clean this up. And they did clean it up a little bit. And that's
Mhm.
why now all over the country, you can see hyperbaric chamber places almost in every single state. Back in
Mhm.
the day, they weren't around. Now, the cannabis industry, I think, could take, some lead from them. I mean, look at that and say, we need to come together and say to ourselves, no, we are not going to try to use some chemicals under the sink to create a new cannabinoid. No, we are not going to put on our shelves or allow to be sold. If I find something being sold at the local gas station out on highway, whatever, blah, 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 I'm gonna report that to the police and say, no, that's not a good product. But we're not doing that. And instead, we're infusing it in some trash that we're providing to our customers. I know people who say, well, I'm going to figure out a way to get around it. What do you mean you're going to figure out a way to get around it? What are you going to make Delta 7 now? Going to make Delta 8.3? And, when we know that there's a federal law that says anytime you synthesize something that has the same reaction as something that's already been illegal, it's as illegal as the original substance, right?
Right.
But it seems like our industry doesn't want to do that. So when I say self-policing, that's what I mean by it. I'm not saying that we have to go in and start tattletelling on everybody, but there are certain things that we need to do
That's right.
to
Absolutely.
protect us.
Absolutely. Yes.
Sure. So anything else you want to add?
I just want to thank you because I think that we see a lot of celebrity brands out there, and I think you've been really intentional about who you work with. And I think that even since 2005, you've changed the way people think about this product, and you've just consistently had a lot of principles, and that's why I wanted to come on the show and talk to you. So
Oh
thank
my
you.
goodness, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And then look, I mean, you're doing, the heavy lifting, the hard work that a lot of people in this industry are afraid to do. So I want you to know you always have a home here. Our listeners are always going to be willing to listen to what you have to say. So if you ever want to update us, you ever want to give us some new feedback, want to have some more conversations, just chop it up. I'd love to have you back. Okay.
Thank you.
For sure. You take care of yourself. And if anybody wanted to get more information about what you do, about the Parabola organization, where would they go?
Parabolacenter.com, and I'm very active on Twitter at Shaleeen Title and on Instagram, Parabola Center.
Okay, for sure. So I'll make sure our viewers, we'll make sure we lower third that so people know how to get a hold of you. Thank you so much for being a part of the show today. And I want to thank all of you for continuing to tune into Let's Be Blunt with Montel. Thanks for joining me on Let's Be Blunt with Montel. Please make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell to be notified when new episodes post each week. We'd love to hear your feedback also, so please send us your comments.